Hi there, I'm Dimitry Anastakis, and I'm a professor in the L.R. Wilson and R.J. Curry Chair in Canadian Business History here at the Rotman School of Management. My expertise is in Canadian business history. I mostly study the automotive industry, but I study all kinds of aspects of business history in Canada and more broadly. And I'm here to answer your questions about the future and past of the business of cars. Welcome to my office hours. Tesla's 20 years old. The Prius hybrid launched in 1995. Why aren't we all driving electric cars already? We're not all driving electric cars already because the electric vehicle revolution is going to unfold and is unfolding and has been unfolding since 1995 and since Tesla appeared, and it'll take another 20 or 30 years for it to fully unfold. So we're not all driving electric vehicles already, but about 10 to 15% of the population is. It's going to continue to increase. It's going to take a lot longer than we think it's going to take, but we're in the beginning of it. And the best comparison that we can have is probably the original automobile revolution, which started around 1900, really got going in 1910 with the launch of the Model T and the beginnings of mass manufacturing the Model T, and finally finished in the 1930s and the 1940s. In comparison, between that 1900 and 1930s kind of spot, we're around 1920 or 1921. This is a point when Henry Ford is really successful with the Model T and everybody's buying Model Ts because it's the most successful vehicle, just like Tesla and Elon Musk. But by the 1920s and a few years later, you see a whole wave of new vehicles come into the marketplace, which is what's happening right now. We're still at the beginning, closer to the beginning of this EV revolution than we are towards the end. Why is the Canadian government subsidizing big name car companies to go electric in the first place? And what do we get out of it? Well, we're subsidizing these car companies because everyone is subsidizing these car companies. We, as Canadians, as a Canadian government, like all governments around the world, are trying to encourage and accelerate this shift from internal combustion engines, which are using and burning fossil fuels, to a place where cars are electric, which means that their carbon footprint is going to be much, much less in terms of how it has an impact upon the environment. One of the reasons that we do this is because we're competing with all kinds of jurisdictions, whether they're communist jurisdictions in China or hardcore right-wing jurisdictions in Alabama and Louisiana that are all providing subsidies for these car companies because they understand that if you want to be at the top of the manufacturing pecking order, you have to be in the EV space going forward. It's the industry of the 21st century. It's as important as chip making, and we need to be there if we want to have a 21st century economy. So what we get out of it is not just helping to accelerate this EV revolution to save ourselves from some of the worst aspects of climate change, but also because it makes good business sense. Do you really need that truck? Some people really do need their trucks. People who are contractors, who work on farms, who work in construction, people who actually need the bed of their vehicle to transport the goods that they work with. Many people have trucks for other reasons. They have them for status reasons, cultural reasons. They're big vehicles. They send an image of ruggedness, masculinity, size, which a lot of people do really like to have because a lot of the times the vehicle that you drive sends a message about who you are, the values that you want to impart. Now, there's a reason that trucks are so big and that they become so popular, especially in the last 40 or 50 years. In the 1970s, governments imposed a lot of regulations around fuel economy and emissions and safety that made vehicles smaller. The same regulations didn't apply in the same way for trucks, which kept their size and have grown and grown and grown, even though fuel economy has gotten a lot better. Will we ever see pre-pandemic car prices again? I hate to say it, but probably not. There was a real jump in prices in the pandemic and post-pandemic era because of supply chain issues, demand issues, production issues. That means costs have gone up, costs have stayed up, and costs will probably continue to accelerate as we shift into this EV revolution. It's really costly to go from internal combustion engine-based industry to an EV-based industry and be building both types of vehicles at the same time. So it's very unlikely that we're going to see a decline in prices. We might see some irregular dips where they go down once in a while, but by and large, you're going to see a continued acceleration in prices of vehicles. I'm sorry to say, It's one of those things like death and taxes. The increase in the price of your vehicle will probably continue pretty much unabated. How on earth did the SUV become so popular, and what the fudge happened to minivans? Well, minivans in some ways went the way of station wagons. Lots of people used to buy station wagons, especially in the post-war period, because people with families need that extra space. In the 1980s and the 1990s, minivans were all the rage. They became one of the most popular vehicles in North America. Generationally, the baby boomers loved them. When the baby boomers' kids grew up, they moved away from minivans and got into SUVs. Sport utility vehicles do the same things as minivans, but they're a lot cooler looking. They're just so practical. It's one of the reasons that they're very popular. They're a little bit higher up. They do everything that a sedan does, but they also have some carrying capacity like minivans do. So I think SUVs are going to stick around for a lot longer, unless AVs show up, which will really change the dynamic of cars. Will autonomous driving ever actually be a thing? Well, in some ways, it already is a thing. Autonomous vehicles and autonomous vehicle pilot programs exist all across North America, including here in Ontario. There's a very small autonomous vehicle AV pilot project where there's a few vehicles that are being test driven to see how they interact. I was on the DVP driving a couple of months ago, and I saw an AV being tested on the DVP. It had a camera on top of the hood, and there was no one in the driver's seat. There was somebody in the passenger seat. Similarly, there are pilot programs going on in the United States, in places like Phoenix, in places like San Francisco, where you can order an Uber and it's an AV. Now, we're still pretty far away from having AVs being commonplace for ordinary people, but they do exist. They are being developed. We're at the very beginning of this rollout. There's a lot to happen before and whether or not they will become the most common way people get around. But in 30 or 40 years, there are probably going to be a lot of AVs on the road. And when they do happen, it'll be something that will really change the dynamic of how we interact with distance and time and our own personal mobility. Why don't we have hover cars yet? And who do I blame for this delay? You can blame science fiction, which misled a whole generation of techno children in the 60s, 70s, and 80s by having shows like The Jetsons or having movies like Back to the Future, which made hover cars seem like they were just around the corner. People have to understand humans can barely drive on roads safely without crashing into each other and without causing pandemonium. Imagine everybody had the ability to float around in their vehicle and not follow the rules of the road or the lines on the street. Hover cars are probably pretty far away at this point. I will say, though, that Honda actually had a pretty good endeavor to build single vehicle planes that were effectively not hover cars, but planes that could double as cars. Hover cars is a technology that we're nowhere near quite yet, and it'll probably take a little bit more imagination and a lot more science fiction before we get there yet. Since I'm not technically driving the car, will autonomous vehicles make insurance cheaper or more expensive? Okay, there is a lot of territory to cover before we get to a point where the impact of AI and AVs are going to be clearly visible. And the best analogy is another historical analogy. When cars first started becoming more popular on the road, a whole legal infrastructure, a whole kind of a political infrastructure, and a whole regulatory infrastructure needed to be built to meet the needs of how cars were now interacting with society. So at the very beginning of the automobile revolution, when the first accidents started happening, nobody knew who was to blame. There was no licensing, there was no insurance, there were no regulations, there were effectively no laws. We had to figure this out. So when the first motor vehicle accident happened, and one of the first fatalities in Toronto and in Canada was right here on College Street in, I think, 1896 or something like that, a whole legal infrastructure had to be developed. And there were a lot of court cases around who was to blame. Was it the chauffeur who was driving the vehicle, the manufacturer of the vehicle who had built it, or the owner of the vehicle who had told the chauffeur where to drive? There were all kinds of uncertainties, and we were trying to figure out what that legal landscape looks like. Fast forward 120 years, the same thing is happening. I will say this much. Cruise, which is the probably most advanced AI manufacturing firm, which is one of General Motors spinoffs, just had to pull all of their AVs off the road in San Francisco because there was an accident. An AV hit someone and caused a fatality. The AV couldn't read what was going on. There were a whole bunch of weird circumstances where something had fallen on the road and the AV made a bad decision. Because there's no real kind of legal regulatory infrastructure, there was a lot of debate about who's to blame for this. Is the company to blame for this? Is the pedestrian to blame for this? Is the state to blame for this because they haven't regulated AVs well enough? And the response was, we've got to figure this stuff out still. So there is a lot of distance to go before we get to a point where we've really established the legal and regulatory frameworks that will answer the question of whether or not autonomous vehicles will make insurance cheaper or more expensive. What can car makers of tomorrow learn from Henry Ford? Well, it so happens that I just published a book called A Dream Car, Malcolm Brickland's fantastic Safety Vehicle 1 and the End of Industrial Modernity, where I talk a lot about Henry Ford and the kinds of lessons that Henry Ford can teach the car makers of today, especially, and tomorrow. A guy like Elon Musk could probably learn a lot from following the career of Henry Ford because in some ways his career is replicating Henry Ford's pattern. And one of the things that Henry Ford would tell Elon Musk if he was alive today is, yes, it's great to be the first mover, to be someone who dominates in a category, but Henry Ford would probably tell Elon Musk that at some point, eventually, your competitors catch up. You need new vehicles, you need new technologies, you need to adapt. And perhaps most importantly, Henry Ford would tell Elon Musk that you probably shouldn't chase all kinds of quixotic and unusual pursuits that don't have anything to do with the car making business, because that's just going to get you in trouble. Henry Ford in the 1910s and the 1920s got involved in all kinds of different things. He ran in politics. He bought a newspaper because he wanted to influence public opinion. He did all kinds of mega projects on the side, just like Elon Musk has done. And Henry Ford faced a pretty sharp decline in the late 1920s and early 1930s. He had a lot of problems because many of his competitors had caught up to him. Elon Musk is going through the same thing right now. Can Canada actually phase out gas vehicles by 2035? That feels ambitious. Yes, it is ambitious. Dramatic change like this is pretty ambitious. And one of the things that we have to recognize is we're not phasing out gas vehicles by 2035. The mandate as it exists is to phase out the sale of new gas vehicles by 2035. There is a historical analogy that's really appropriate. In the 1970s, the governments in North America imposed a lot of requirements and regulations on the car manufacturers to make their cars a lot more fuel efficient and a lot less polluting by the mid-1980s. Now, it was a target that the car companies didn't meet. They didn't meet initially. In fact, it took them an extra 5 or 10 years to meet those fuel economy and emissions expectations of what cars did, but they did meet them. And in fact, they surpassed them. So the cars of today that are internal combustion engine cars that are gas-burning cars are way more fuel efficient than the cars in the 1970s. They've surpassed all the expectations. And when it comes to pollution, they're way less polluting. In other words, we did it. The car companies did it because the governments encouraged them to do it. And I think that the car companies will eventually meet the targets of all new vehicles being electric vehicles or hybrids not by 2035, but probably by the early 2040s. Those are all the questions for today. If you want to learn more about business history or car manufacturing, click on the link below to visit the Rotman Insights Hub. Thanks for joining me.